The soft hum of medical equipment filled the dimly lit hospital room. Alana Richards lay in bed, her frail frame bathed in the pale glow of the moonlight streaming through the window. She had been here for weeks, fighting a rare autoimmune disease that had left her exhausted but not defeated. The quiet beep of the heart monitor was her constant companion, a rhythmic reminder of life's fragility. Tonight, however, something felt off. The hallways, usually bustling even at odd hours, were eerily silent. The fluorescent lights outside her room flickered intermittently, casting unsettling shadows. A faint smell of disinfectant lingered in the air, mingling with a sense of unease that Alana couldn't shake. She clutched her phone, scrolling through photos of her husband, Malcolm. His smile, always so full of life, gave her strength. She whispered to herself, "One more day, Alana, you'll get through this." Little did she know, the night would test her in ways she could never have imagined. Dr. Edward Grayson staggered down the empty corridor, his white coat askew, a half-empty flask of bourbon clutched in his hand. His once pristine reputation as a brilliant surgeon had eroded over the years, tarnished by whispers of malpractice and unprofessional behavior. Yet, his charm and connections had always kept him untouchable. Tonight, though, he was alone, his demons louder than ever. The alcohol coursing through his veins dulled his inhibitions but amplified his hatred. He muttered to himself, railing against the hospital's new policies, the influx of undesirable patients, and, most venomously, the rumored acquisition of the hospital by a wealthy black businessman. A man like that buying this place, disgraceful. He spat, venom dripping from every word. As he wandered aimlessly, his eyes fell on the chart outside Alana's room. Her name was unfamiliar, but her race and condition were not. He smirked, a cruel idea taking shape in his twisted mind. Alana stirred as the door creaked open. She blinked, disoriented, as a tall figure loomed in the doorway. At first, she thought it was a nurse or orderly making late-night rounds. But as the figure stepped into the light, her heart sank. Dr. Grayson's bloodshot eyes locked onto hers. His expression was a grotesque mix of disdain and amusement. Well, he slurred, leaning against the doorframe. "Look at you, taking up space here." Alana's voice wavered. Is there something wrong? Doctor? Wrong? He laughed, a harsh, mocking sound. "What's wrong is people like you thinking you deserve the same care as decent folks." Fear coiled in her stomach as his words sank in. "Please, I don't understand. Don't you dare talk back to me," he snapped, his voice sharp and menacing. He staggered closer, his movements erratic but deliberate. "You people are the reason this hospital's going to hell. You think your kind can just walk in and demand to be treated like everyone else?" Alana's hands trembled as she reached for the call button. But Grayson was faster. He snatched it from her grasp, throwing it to the floor. "No one's coming to save you," he sneered. Alana's mind raced. She tried to reason with him, her voice steady despite the terror gripping her. "Doctor, I don't know what I've done to upset you. But please, I'm just here to get better. I'm no different from any other patient." Her words only fueled his rage. "Different? Don't insult me. You don't belong here, and you sure as hell don't belong in the same world as me." He grabbed her wrist, his grip bruising. Alana cried out, struggling to free herself, but her weakened state left her defenseless. Tears streamed down her face as she begged, "Please, don't hurt me. I'm someone's wife, someone's daughter. I don't deserve this." Grayson's lips curled into a sneer. "You think that matters to me? You're nothing." Just as Alana felt herself slipping into despair, a faint sound reached her ears. Footsteps. They were distant but growing louder. Hope flickered within her as she mustered the strength to scream, "Help! Someone, please!" Grayson panicked, his drunken bravado faltering. He released her wrist, stumbling backward. "Shut up. No one's going to believe you." The footsteps stopped outside the door. A nurse peeked in, her eyes widening at the scene before her. "Dr. Grayson, what are you doing?" she demanded, her voice shaking. "Get out," he bellowed. But it was too late. The nurse had already pressed the emergency alarm, summoning a flood of staff within minutes. The room was filled with hospital personnel. Grayson, realizing the gravity of the situation, tried to feign innocence, but his slurred speech and disheveled appearance betrayed him. Security escorted him away, his protests falling on deaf ears. Alana, trembling and in shock, was surrounded by caring hands. Nurses and doctors reassured her, but her heart remained heavy. She knew the scars from this night would not fade easily. As she was wheeled to a new room for observation, her mind turned to Malcolm. She needed him now more than ever. She clung to the thought of his unwavering support, a beacon of hope amidst the darkness. Little did she know, Malcolm was already on his way. And when he arrived, the full weight of justice would come crashing down on Dr. Grayson. The hospital at night was a world unto itself, a mosaic of quiet desperation and faint hope. Alana Richards lay in her bed, her body weak but her spirit unbroken. A fighter her whole life, she had overcome obstacles that would have crushed others. This illness, as debilitating as it was, felt like just another mountain to climb. Her room, tucked away at the far end of the ward, was quiet except for the occasional hum of machines monitoring her vitals. Outside, the hallways were a labyrinth of flickering lights and muted voices. Somewhere down the corridor, a janitor's mop squeaked faintly against the tile floor. For the first time in days, Alana felt a sliver of peace. But peace is fragile. As she lay scrolling through her phone, she paused on a photo of her husband, Malcolm. He stood beside her in a park, his arms around her waist, his face lit with the kind of smile that made her believe everything would be okay. She whispered to herself, "One more day, Malcolm, just one more day, and I'll be strong enough to go home to you." The distant clang of a metal cart jolted her from her thoughts. The sound was sharp, almost jarring in the stillness. She glanced at the door, her brow furrowing. Something about the noise unsettled her, but she brushed it off. Hospitals were noisy places, even at night, yet a shadow lingered at the edge of her mind. Dr. Edward Grayson staggered through the corridor, his polished shoes scuffing against the linoleum floor. His flask was empty now, its contents having dulled his senses and amplified his anger. His colleagues called him brilliant, a savant in the operating room, but brilliance could not mask the rot within him. Years of unchecked privilege, prejudice, and addiction had turned him into a man barely recognizable. As he stumbled past the nurse's station, a junior nurse looked up from her clipboard, concern flickering in her eyes. "Dr. Grayson, are you okay? You shouldn't be. Mind your damn business," he snapped, his voice low and venomous. The nurse flinched, her cheeks flushing as she quickly averted her gaze. Grayson sneered, his grip tightening around the empty flask. His gaze landed on the chart outside room 347. The name, Alana Richards, meant nothing to him, but the note beneath it caught his eye: African American female. Critical condition. His lips twisted into a cruel smirk. He pushed the door open. Alana stirred as the door creaked open, her heart skipping a beat. She expected to see a nurse or an orderly, maybe even a doctor making late-night rounds. Instead, a tall figure filled the doorway, his silhouette jagged and unsteady. The air in the room grew colder, heavier. "Good evening," Dr. Grayson drawled, his words slurred but dripping with malice. He stepped inside, letting the door swing shut behind him. His bloodshot eyes scanned her frail form, his expression a mix of disdain and twisted amusement. Alana tried to sit up, her instincts screaming that something was wrong. "Doctor, is everything okay?" Grayson's laughter was harsh and bitter. "Oh, everything's just fine. I was just thinking about how people like you, people like your kind, think you deserve to be here." Her breath caught in her throat. "I don't understand," she said cautiously, her voice trembling. "You don't need to understand," he snapped, advancing toward her bed. "You're nothing but a burden, a parasite. You think this hospital was built for people like you? You think you have the right to the same care as everyone else?" Alana's chest tightened. She reached for the call button, but Grayson was quicker. He yanked it from her grasp and threw it across the room. The small device clattered to the floor, its red light blinking uselessly. "Please," she whispered, her voice cracking. "I don't want any trouble. Just let me be." Grayson leaned in close, the stench of alcohol heavy on his breath. "Oh, you'll get trouble," he hissed. "You'll get exactly what you deserve." Alana's mind raced as adrenaline surged through her veins. She pushed against him, her hands weak but desperate. "Don't do this," she pleaded, tears streaming down her face. "I'm someone's wife, someone's mother. Please." Her words only seemed to fuel his rage. He grabbed her wrist, his grip ironclad. "You think that matters to me? You think your pathetic little life means anything?" he spat, yanking her arm so hard she cried out in pain. Somewhere deep within her, a flicker of defiance sparked. Alana kicked at him, her legs weak but determined. The sudden movement startled Grayson, and he stumbled backward, cursing loudly. "You little," he snarled. But before he could lunge at her again, a faint noise caught his attention. Footsteps. The sound of approaching footsteps grew louder, steady and deliberate. Grayson froze, his drunken bravado faltering for the first time. His head snapped toward the door just as it swung open. A nurse stood in the doorway, her face pale with shock. "Dr. Grayson, what are you doing?" she demanded, her voice shaking. Grayson straightened, trying to regain his composure. "Get out of here," he barked, but his words were slurred, his movements erratic. The nurse didn't budge. Her eyes darted to Alana, who was clutching her arm, tears streaming down her cheeks. The sight steeled her resolve. She pressed a button on the wall, triggering the emergency alarm. Within moments, the room was flooded with hospital staff. Grayson tried to bluster his way out, shouting incoherent denials, but it was no use. Security arrived, their expressions grim as they escorted him away. Alana, trembling and in shock, was surrounded by nurses and doctors. Their voices were gentle, their hands careful as they checked her injuries. But her mind was elsewhere, replaying the nightmare that had just unfolded. In the early hours of the morning, as the first rays of sunlight pierced the darkness, Alana lay in a new room. Her body ached, and her spirit felt fractured. But she was alive. Her phone buzzed on the bedside table. With shaking hands, she picked it up and saw Malcolm's name flashing on the screen. She answered, her voice barely a whisper. "Malcolm?" His voice was firm but laced with worry. "Alana, I'm on my way. I just got a call from the hospital." "What happened?" Tears welled in her eyes. He tried to hurt me. He said such awful things." Silence hung between them for a moment before Malcolm spoke again, his tone steady and resolute. "No one hurts my wife. No one. I'll make sure of it." As she hung up, Alana felt a flicker of hope. She knew Malcolm would move heaven and earth to protect her and ensure justice was served. What she didn't know was just how far he would go, and how much the man who hurt her would suffer. The silence in the aftermath was deafening. Alana lay in her new hospital room, every fiber of her being trembling from the assault. Nurses moved quietly around her, checking her vitals and whispering words of comfort. But their voices felt distant, like murmurs from another world. The physical pain was manageable. She had endured worse during her illness. But the emotional wound was deeper than anything she had ever experienced. She had always believed that hospitals were sanctuaries, places of healing and safety. Tonight, that belief had been shattered. Her mind raced with questions. Would anyone believe her? Would they protect her? Or would they shield Dr. Grayson, a man who had clearly wielded power in this place for years? But then her thoughts shifted to Malcolm. Her Malcolm, a man who had promised to always stand by her, to fight for her when she couldn't fight for herself. She clung to the memory of his voice on the phone, steady and strong, and whispered into the quiet, "He'll make it right. He always does." Malcolm Richards strode into the hospital lobby like a storm ready to break. Dressed in a sharp tailored suit, his presence exuded power and control, but his face betrayed his fury. His dark eyes scanned the room, locking onto a flustered receptionist who barely had time to look up before he demanded, "Where's my wife?" The receptionist stammered, trying to respond, but a senior nurse stepped in. "Mr. Richards, your wife has been moved to a secure room for her safety. I'll take you to her." As they walked through the labyrinthine halls, the nurse hesitated before speaking. I want you to know we're doing everything we can for her. What happened tonight was unconscionable." Malcolm stopped, turning to face her with a piercing gaze. "Unconscionable doesn't even begin to describe it. Tell me, how long has this man been a danger to your patients? How many others have suffered because no one had the backbone to stop him?" The nurse looked down, her face pale. I don't know, but I promise you, we're taking this seriously." "Not seriously enough," Malcolm said coldly. "Believe me, this isn't over." When he finally entered Alana's room, his heart clenched at the sight of her. She looked so small, so fragile, lying there with bruises forming on her wrists and fear lingering in her eyes. He crossed the room in 2 quick strides and took her hand gently in his. "Alana," he said, his voice softer now, "I'm here." Her tears flowed freely as she whispered, "Malcolm, he tried to." "I know," he said, his jaw tightening. "And I swear to you, he'll pay for what he's done. No one lays a hand on you and gets away with it." As Malcolm sat beside Alana, gently stroking her hand, his phone buzzed incessantly on the table. Calls, emails, and messages poured in from his legal team and business partners. The news was already spreading: a prominent doctor accused of assaulting a patient. And not just any patient, but the wife of the man poised to buy the hospital. One call in particular caught his attention. It was from his lead attorney, Marcus Lane. "Malcolm, it's worse than we thought," Marcus said without preamble. "Grayson has a history. Multiple complaints of misconduct, racist comments, even a couple of quiet settlements. The hospital's been covering for him." Malcolm's grip on the phone tightened. "And they think they can cover this up too?" "They'll try," Marcus said. "The board is scrambling. They know your acquisition gives you leverage. But they're hoping you'll settle quietly to avoid a media circus." Malcolm's voice was ice. "They don't know who they're dealing with. I'm not settling. I'm burning this place to the ground if I have to." Later that evening, as the hospital buzzed with whispered rumors and hurried meetings, Alana insisted on telling Malcolm everything. Sitting up in bed, her voice wavered but grew steadier with every word. "He was drunk," she began, her hands twisting nervously in her lap. "I could smell it on him. And the things he said. Malcolm, it wasn't just me. It was everyone who looks like me. He hates us. He made that clear." Malcolm listened silently, his expression unreadable, but inside, a fire burned. Every word Alana spoke was another log on the pyre of his fury. When she finished, he took her hand and said, "You did nothing wrong. None of this is your fault. And I promise you, by the time I'm done, he'll regret the day he ever stepped into this hospital." Alana looked at him, her eyes shining with a mixture of gratitude and fear. "Just be careful, Malcolm. People like him. They think they can get away with anything. And sometimes, they do." "Not this time," Malcolm said firmly. "Not while I'm breathing." The next morning, Malcolm arrived at the hospital's boardroom unannounced, his legal team in tow. The board members, caught off guard, exchanged nervous glances as he entered. At the head of the table sat Dr. Howard Gaines, the hospital's chief administrator, a man known for his silver tongue and slippery ethics. "Mr. Richards," Gaines said with a practiced smile, "we were just discussing." "Save it," Malcolm interrupted, his voice cutting through the room like a blade. "You all knew about Grayson. You knew he was a liability. And you kept him here anyway. You endangered every patient in this hospital, including my wife. That ends now." Gaines's smile faltered. "Now, let's not jump to conclusions. Dr. Grayson has been an asset to this hospital for years. If there's been a misunderstanding." "A misunderstanding?" Malcolm's voice rose, his anger barely contained. He threw a file onto the table, its contents spilling out: copies of complaints, internal memos, and settlement agreements. "Explain this. Then, explain why you've been covering for a racist, abusive alcoholic." The room fell silent. Gaines shifted uncomfortably in his seat. But before he could respond, Malcolm leaned forward, his tone deadly. "I own this hospital now," he said, "and the first thing I'm going to do is clean house. Starting with Grayson. And if any of you try to stop me, I'll make sure you go down with him." As Malcolm left the boardroom, his mind raced with plans. He would ensure Grayson was stripped of his license, held accountable in court, and exposed for the monster he was. But he knew this fight wasn't just about Alana. It was about every patient who had suffered in silence, every complaint that had been swept under the rug. Back in her room, Alana watched the sunlight streaming through the window, a sense of quiet resolve settling over her. She was still shaken, but she wasn't broken. She had Malcolm, and she had faith that justice would prevail. But neither of them knew just how far Grayson would go to protect himself, or how dangerous the fight for justice would become. Malcolm didn't waste time. The morning after the confrontation with the hospital board, his legal team assembled in his office. The tension in the room was palpable as Marcus Lane, his lead attorney, spread out documents across the mahogany table. "This is the paper trail we've been able to piece together," Marcus began. "Grayson's malpractice complaints date back over a decade. Several patients filed grievances, but most were silenced through settlements." Malcolm's jaw tightened. "Settlements they signed under duress." "No doubt," Marcus nodded. "It gets worse. Some of the victims were low-income patients who couldn't afford to take the fight to court. They were scared, and Grayson's reputation kept them quiet." "And the board?" Malcolm asked. his voice like steel. They've been complicit, Marcus replied. The hospital has been covering for Grayson to protect their own image. If this goes public, it won't just be him going down, it'll be the entire administration. Malcolm leaned back in his chair. His hands steepled in thought. Good, then we make it public. This isn't just about Alana anymore. It's about every person he's ever hurt. Back at the hospital, the atmosphere was electric with whispered rumors. Staff members, from doctors to janitors, spoke in hushed tones about what had happened. Dr. Grayson's name was on everyone's lips. But so was Malcolm's. Some admired his determination, while others feared the changes he would bring. Alana, still recovering, noticed the change whenever a nurse entered her room. They were more attentive, their voices softer, their smiles more apologetic, but she couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't just compassion, they were afraid. Afraid of her, or rather, of what her husband represented. One nurse, a young woman named Ellie, hesitated as she adjusted Alana's IV drip. Mrs. Richards, she said cautiously, I just want you to know, we're all rooting for you. Alana looked at her, surprised. Thank you, Ellie. That means a lot. Ellie hesitated again, glancing at the door before leaning in. There are others who wanted to speak up about Dr. Grayson before. But they didn't feel safe. Maybe now they will. Her words lingered in Alana's mind long after Ellie left. Could she become a voice for those who had been silenced? And if so, at what cost? Meanwhile, Dr. Edward Grayson was unraveling. The once confident surgeon now found himself under siege. His office was sealed, his files confiscated, and his colleagues avoided him as though he were contagious. He spent his days pacing his lavish home, drowning in whiskey and self-pity. But Grayson wasn't the type to go down without a fight. Late one night, he made a call to an old friend, Charles Winters, a prominent hospital attorney known for his ruthless tactics. You have to help me. Charles, Grayson slurred, his voice desperate. They're coming for me. That Richards bastard wants to ruin me. Calm down, Edward, Charles replied coolly. I've seen the reports. It's not just Richards. You've left a trail of bodies. Figuratively speaking, it's a miracle you lasted this long. Don't lecture me, Grayson snapped. Just tell me how to get out of this. Charles sighed. The best I can do is mitigate the damage. But if you think you're walking away from this unscathed, you're delusional. Start preparing for the fallout. Grayson hung up, his mind racing. If the law wouldn't protect him, he'd have to protect himself. By any means necessary as Malcolm fought his battle in boardrooms and courtrooms. Alana began her own journey toward healing. Sitting by her window one afternoon, she watched the world outside, the steady rhythm of cars, the distant laughter of children. It reminded her that life continued, even when hers felt stuck. A knock at the door broke her reverie. It was Ellie again, this time holding a folder. Mrs. Richards, she said nervously, I thought you should see this. Alana opened the folder, her heart sinking as she read. Inside were statements from other patients who had encountered Grayson, stories of negligence, cruelty, and outright abuse. Some were written anonymously, but others bore trembling signatures. Why are you showing me this? Alana asked, her voice trembling. Ellie looked down. Because we think you can help. You have a platform now. People will listen to you. Alana closed the folder, her hands shaking. She had always been a private person, someone who avoided the spotlight. But now, looking at the stories of those who had suffered in silence, she realized she couldn't stay silent herself. Malcolm's team moved swiftly. Within days, media outlets picked up the story. Prominent surgeon accused of assault and racism, hospital under fire. The article detailed not only Alana's ordeal but also the broader pattern of abuse and negligence. Victims began to come forward, their voices amplified by the coverage. The hospital board scrambled to contain the damage. Dr. Howard Gaines held a press conference, his polished demeanor betraying no hint of panic. We are conducting a thorough internal investigation, he assured the reporters. We take these allegations very seriously. But Malcolm wasn't satisfied with platitudes. He stepped up to the podium, his presence commanding. This isn't just about one man's actions, he said, his voice steady but impassioned. It's about a system that allowed him to thrive. This hospital covered for him, silencing victims and prioritizing profits over patients. That ends now. The crowd erupted in questions. But Malcolm walked away, his message delivered. Alana watched the broadcast from her hospital bed, tears streaming down her face. For the first time in days, she felt hope, not just for herself, but for everyone Grayson had wronged. The pressure became unbearable for Grayson. His name was tarnished, his career in shambles, and now he faced criminal charges. The hospital, desperate to distance itself, revoked his privileges and handed over damning evidence to the authorities. One evening, as he sat alone in his study, Grayson stared at a framed certificate on the wall. Dr. Edward Grayson, excellence in medicine. He hurled it across the room, the glass shattering into 1,000 pieces. For the first time, he felt the weight of his actions, not as regret, but as fear. Fear of losing everything he had built. Fear of becoming nothing. But fear didn't absolve him. It only made him more dangerous as the case against Grayson moved forward. Malcolm and Alana found themselves under attack. Tabloids dug into their past, painting Malcolm as a ruthless businessman and Alana as an opportunist. Online trolls flooded social media with hateful comments, accusing them of exploiting the situation for fame. The strain began to take its toll. One night, as Malcolm sat by Alana's side, she reached for his hand. "This fight, it's bigger than us. Isn't it?" "Yes," he said, his voice heavy. "But that doesn't mean it's not worth fighting." Alana nodded, her grip tightening. "Then we fight. Together." What began as a personal battle grew into a movement. Activists rallied around Alana's story, demanding accountability in healthcare. Patients who had been ignored or mistreated found their voices, sharing their stories in protests and on social media. Alana, once reluctant to step into the spotlight, became a reluctant but powerful advocate. In interviews, she spoke with raw honesty about her experience, her voice trembling but resolute. "This isn't just about me," she said during one appearance. "It's about everyone who's ever felt invisible, unheard, or unimportant. We all deserve dignity and respect, no matter who we are." Grayson's trial was set to begin. But the court of public opinion had already rendered its verdict. As evidence piled up, even his staunchest defenders abandoned him. The hospital board, desperate to salvage their reputation, offered Malcolm full cooperation, including their resignation en masse. But Malcolm wasn't satisfied with resignations. He demanded systemic change, new policies, better oversight, and mandatory training to combat bias. As the dust began to settle, Alana and Malcolm found a quiet moment together. Sitting on a park bench, watching the sunset, they reflected on how far they'd come. "This isn't the end," Alana said softly. "There's still so much to do." Malcolm nodded, his hand in hers. "But it's a start." The morning sun streamed through the tall windows of Malcolm Richards' office, but its warmth failed to soften the cold determination in his gaze. He stood at the head of the conference table, his legal team seated before him, the weight of their findings heavy in the room. "We're not here to negotiate," Malcolm said firmly, pacing slowly. "We're here to make it clear. We will expose every layer of this cover-up, no matter how deep it goes." Marcus Lane, his lead attorney, nodded. "The evidence is overwhelming, Malcolm. Grayson's malpractice history, the hospital's attempts to silence victims, it's all there. But going public means war. The board will fight tooth and nail to protect themselves." "Let them," Malcolm said sharply, stopping to face the group. "This isn't just about justice for Alana anymore. This is about dismantling a system that let Grayson thrive." His voice softened as he added, "We have to do this right. Not just for her, but for every patient who was ignored, mistreated, or silenced." The room fell silent, his words sinking in. One by one, the lawyers nodded. They understood the stakes, and the battle ahead back at the hospital. The tension was palpable. Staff members who had once idolized Dr. Grayson now avoided even speaking his name. Nurses whispered in break rooms, recounting instances of his cruel behavior. Some confessed guilt for not speaking out sooner, while others feared the repercussions of aligning themselves with Malcolm. Alana's room became an unexpected center of gravity. Her presence, once overlooked, now carried a quiet power. Nurses and staff began visiting her, sharing their own stories of what they had witnessed. "I remember one time," Ellie, the young nurse, said, her voice trembling. "A patient, a single mother, begged Dr. Grayson to explain a procedure. He brushed her off and called her things I can't even repeat. She cried for hours after he left." Alana listened, her heart heavy. "Why didn't anyone report him?" she asked gently. Ellie looked down, shame coloring her cheeks. "We tried, but He was untouchable. The board always covered for him. We were told to focus on our duties and leave the big decisions to leadership. Alana reached out and took Ellie's hand. It's not your fault, but now, we have to make sure no one else goes through this. The hospital board convened an emergency meeting. Their usual veneer of control slipping under the weight of scandal. At the head of the table, Dr. Howard Gaines tried to maintain order. But the room buzzed with nervous energy. This is spiraling out of control, one member said, slamming a folder onto the table. The media's all over it. We need to issue a statement. A statement won't fix this. Another retorted, we need a scapegoat. Grayson's the obvious choice. Dr. Gaines raised a hand to silence the room. Let's not lose sight of the bigger picture. The hospital's reputation is at stake. If Richards goes public with more evidence, we'll all be implicated. Before anyone could respond, the door opened, and Malcolm walked in, flanked by Marcus Lane and a pair of assistants. The board members stiffened as he approached the table. Mr. Richards, Gaines began, forcing a smile. This is a private meeting. Not anymore. Malcolm interrupted, his voice calm but commanding. You've made this everyone's problem. And now, I'm here to make sure you answer for it. He placed a stack of documents on the table. These are the complaints you buried. The settlements you forced victims to sign. The emails proving you knew exactly who Grayson was, and chose to protect him. The board was silent, their faces a mix of shock and fury. Gaines attempted to regain control. You can't prove those documents are authentic. Malcolm leaned forward, his eyes locked on Gaines. Oh, but I can, and I will. If you think I'm bluffing, test me, I dare you. While Malcolm dismantled the board's defenses, Edward Grayson found himself increasingly isolated. His home, once a symbol of his success, now felt like a prison. He spent his days drinking, pacing, and calling old connections in a desperate bid for support. But the calls went unanswered. His colleagues distanced themselves, his friends abandoned him, and even his family refused to pick up. The man who had once commanded respect now found himself utterly alone. Late one night, he stared at his reflection in the mirror. His once pristine appearance was gone. His face was gaunt. His eyes bloodshot. For the first time, he saw the truth. He wasn't the victim of a witch hunt. He was the architect of his own downfall. But instead of remorse, anger consumed him. If he was going down, he decided, he wouldn't go quietly as Malcolm fought in boardrooms and courts. Alana found her own strength. With Ellie's help, she compiled statements from other victims and staff members. Each story added weight to the growing case against Grayson and the hospital. When a journalist reached out for an interview, Alana hesitated. She wasn't used to being in the spotlight, and the thought of reliving her trauma on national television terrified her. But Ellie's words echoed in her mind. Maybe now, they'll feel safe. The day of the interview, Alana sat under the bright studio lights, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. The journalist, a kind-faced woman named Sandra, began with gentle questions about her health and recovery. But soon, the conversation shifted. Alana, Sandra said softly, why do you think so many people stayed silent about Dr. Grayson for so long? Alana took a deep breath. Fear, she said simply. Fear of not being believed. Fear of retaliation. Fear of being labeled as difficult or disruptive. She paused, her voice trembling. I was afraid too, but now, I know that silence only helps the abuser. If we want change, we have to speak up, even when it's hard. The interview aired that evening, and within hours, social media erupted with support. Hashtags like #Justice for Alana and #End Racism in Healthcare trended nationwide. The pressure mounted on the hospital board. Public outcry grew louder, fueled by Alana's bravery and Malcolm's relentless pursuit of justice. Patients who had suffered under Grayson began to come forward, their voices adding to the chorus demanding change. Facing mounting legal threats and a collapsing reputation, the board finally broke. Dr. Howard Gaines announced his resignation, along with several senior administrators. Grayson was formally fired, and his medical license was suspended pending further investigation. But Malcolm wasn't done. This isn't just about removing a few bad actors, he told reporters outside the courthouse. It's about rebuilding a system that protects patients, not predators. In the weeks that followed, the case against Grayson moved swiftly. The evidence was undeniable, and the court of public opinion had already condemned him. When police arrived at his home to arrest him, He didn't resist. The fight had left him. As he was led away in handcuffs, reporters shouted questions. Dr. Grayson, do you have any regrets? What would you say to your victims? He didn't answer. For the first time, Edward Grayson was truly powerless, with Grayson behind bars and the hospital under new leadership. Alana and Malcolm finally found a moment of peace. Sitting together on their porch, they reflected on how far they had come. It's not over, Alana said, her hand resting on Malcolm's. There's still so much work to do. I know, Malcolm replied, his voice soft. But for now, let's take a moment to breathe. As the sun dipped below the horizon, they sat in silence, the weight of their journey lifting, replaced by the quiet strength of hope as Malcolm continued to push for systemic change. The hospital board, cornered and desperate, tried one final maneuver to save themselves. Dr. Howard Gaines, though publicly resigned, secretly organized a coalition of wealthy allies to counter Malcolm's efforts. Their goal was to protect the hospital's remaining power structure and, if possible, discredit Malcolm entirely. We need to flip the narrative, Gaines told the group during a late-night meeting in a private club. If we can make Richards seem like an overreaching outsider, someone threatening the stability of healthcare, we might salvage this. The strategy was ruthless. Leak misleading information to the media, question Malcolm's motivations, and plant seeds of doubt about Alana's credibility. Within days, tabloids began publishing articles questioning Malcolm's business practices and hinting that his takeover of the hospital was more about personal revenge than justice. Malcolm was furious when the stories broke. Sitting in his office, surrounded by his team, he read aloud from one particularly vicious piece. Is this about justice or power? Malcolm Richards' hidden agenda. Power? Malcolm scoffed, slamming the newspaper down. I'm trying to fix their mess. And they're spinning this into some kind of vendetta? Marcus Lane placed a reassuring hand on Malcolm's shoulder. This is what they do when they're losing. Stay focused. The truth is on our side. But Malcolm knew that truth wasn't always enough amid the smear campaign. Malcolm and Alana received an unexpected ally, Dr. Sophia Nguyen, a respected pediatric surgeon who had worked at the hospital for over 15 years. Known for her integrity and fierce advocacy for patient care, Dr. Nguyen had grown disillusioned with the board's leadership and their repeated failures to address systemic issues. She approached Malcolm after one of his public statements. Mr. Richards, I've stayed quiet for too long, she admitted, her voice steady but laced with regret. I've seen the corruption. I've seen what they've done to protect people like Grayson. If you'll have me, I want to help. Her support was a turning point. Dr. Nguyen's reputation gave Malcolm's cause additional credibility, and her insider knowledge of the hospital's inner workings proved invaluable. Together, they began crafting a comprehensive plan to overhaul the institution. From implementing bias training to creating a patient advocacy office. Change won't come overnight, Dr. Nguyen warned, but with the right leadership, it will come. While Malcolm and Alana gained momentum, Edward Grayson, now awaiting trial, began to plot his own revenge. Though stripped of his license and publicly disgraced, he still had money and connections. From his lawyer's office, he orchestrated a smear campaign targeting Alana directly. Anonymous emails were sent to reporters, claiming Alana had fabricated parts of her story. Grayson's team even reached out to former hospital staff, coercing them to provide statements downplaying his behavior. The backlash was immediate. Social media, once a source of support for Alana, became a battlefield. Anonymous accounts flooded her profiles with hateful comments, calling her a liar and accusing her of seeking fame. One night, as she scrolled through the vitriol online, Alana's hands shook. Why are they doing this? She whispered, tears streaming down her face. Why would anyone believe him after everything he's done? Malcolm pulled her into his arms. Because they're afraid of what you represent. You're proof that their power isn't absolute. And that terrifies them. Alana looked up at him, her eyes filled with determination. Then let's make sure they never hurt anyone else again. Amid the chaos, a former hospital administrator named Karen Bell came forward with damning evidence against Grayson and the board. Karen had resigned years earlier after clashing with leadership over their protection of Grayson. But she had kept records of her attempts to expose him. In a televised interview, Karen detailed the lengths to which the hospital had gone to shield Grayson. I reported him multiple times, she said, her voice trembling with emotion. I begged the board to take action, but they always found excuses. They told me he was too valuable. That his reputation would protect the hospital's image. Her testimony was explosive, reigniting public outrage and forcing the board into a defensive position. Karen's courage inspired other former staff to speak out, creating a flood of new evidence that further implicated the hospital's leadership. Watching the interview from their living room, Alana turned to Malcolm. She risked everything to tell the truth. She said quietly, "We have to make sure her voice is heard." Edward Grayson's trial became a media spectacle. Cameras crowded the courthouse steps as protesters gathered outside, holding signs demanding justice for his victims. Inside, the atmosphere was tense as the prosecution laid out their case. Witness after witness took the stand, detailing Grayson's abuse of power. Patients recounted harrowing experiences of neglect and cruelty, while former colleagues admitted to witnessing his behavior but feeling powerless to stop it. Alana was called to testify on the third day. As she sat in the witness box, the courtroom fell silent. She took a deep breath, her eyes meeting Malcolm's in the gallery before she began. She recounted every detail of that horrifying night, her voice steady despite the pain. When the defense attorney tried to undermine her credibility, suggesting she was exaggerating, Alana responded with quiet strength. "Why would I lie?" she asked, her voice firm. "What would I gain by reliving this nightmare? The only thing I want is for no one else to suffer the way I did." Her testimony was a turning point, galvanizing public support and leaving the defense scrambling. After weeks of testimony and deliberation, the jury returned with their verdict: guilty on multiple counts of assault, negligence, and endangerment. Edward Grayson sat stone-faced as the judge handed down a harsh sentence: 20 years in prison and permanent revocation of his medical license. Outside the courthouse, cheers erupted from the crowd. Alana and Malcolm, flanked by their legal team, stepped out to face the press. "This isn't just a victory for us," Malcolm said, his voice carrying over the din. "It's a victory for every patient who has ever been ignored, every voice that has ever been silenced. And it's just the beginning, with Grayson behind bars and the hospital under new leadership." Malcolm and Dr. Nguyen worked tirelessly to implement reforms. They introduced mandatory bias training, established an independent oversight committee, and created a fund to support victims of medical malpractice. Alana, meanwhile, found her own way to contribute. She launched a nonprofit organization dedicated to advocating for patients' rights, using her experience to empower others. At the grand reopening of the hospital, now renamed the Richards Center for Equity in Healthcare, Alana stood before a crowd of staff, patients, and supporters. Her voice rang clear as she spoke. "This place isn't just a hospital. It's a promise that everyone, no matter who they are, will be treated with dignity and respect." The applause was thunderous, but what mattered most to Alana was the feeling of hope, a hope that the world, though flawed, could change for the better. Edward Grayson sat alone in his prison cell, the harsh fluorescent light casting sharp shadows across the room. The trial had stripped him of everything: his career, his reputation, and the power he had wielded for decades. His days were now filled with monotony. His only companions the regrets he refused to admit and the bitterness that festered within him. But the world outside had moved on. The Richards case had ignited a firestorm of reforms and advocacy, forcing institutions nationwide to reevaluate their policies. Grayson's fall was just the beginning of a larger reckoning. One evening, as he stared at the peeling paint on the walls, a guard approached with a letter. It was unsigned but written in a familiar, elegant hand. The message was simple: "Do you regret it yet? You should." For the first time, Grayson felt the weight of his actions, not as a triumphant legacy, but as a litany of horrors that could never be undone. Back at the newly renamed Richards Center for Equity in Healthcare, Alana was settling into her role as the head of the patient advocacy program. Her days were filled with listening to patient stories, mentoring staff, and shaping policies that put care above profit. One afternoon, she met Maria Thompson, a soft-spoken mother of 3 who had been one of Grayson's patients. Maria's voice cracked as she described the neglect she had endured during a complicated pregnancy under Grayson's care. "I thought I was overreacting," Maria admitted, tears streaming down her face. "But after hearing your story, I realized I wasn't crazy. He was wrong." Alana reached across the desk, taking Maria's hands in her own. "You weren't crazy, Maria, and you weren't alone. What happened to you was real. And it was wrong, but we're going to make sure it doesn't happen to anyone else. The moment was bittersweet but powerful. A reminder of the work that still needed to be done for Malcolm. The victory over Grayson and the hospital board was only the first step. His focus had shifted to broader systemic reforms, working with a coalition of activists, lawmakers, and medical professionals. He began drafting legislation aimed at increasing transparency and accountability in healthcare. One of his key allies was Senator Diana Cole, a fiery advocate for social justice who shared Malcolm's vision. Together, they spearheaded the Equitable Care Act, a landmark bill designed to prevent abuses like Grayson's from happening again. The journey wasn't easy. Opponents accused Malcolm of overreaching, painting him as a businessman interfering in areas he didn't understand. But Malcolm's resolve never wavered. He had witnessed the consequences of a broken system firsthand, and he wasn't about to back down. The act passed with overwhelming public support, cementing Malcolm's legacy as more than just a businessman. He was a reformer, a fighter for justice despite their progress. The scars of Grayson's actions lingered. One day, Alana received an unexpected letter. It was from a former nurse who had worked closely with Grayson during his tenure. The letter was an apology, filled with remorse for staying silent. "I saw what he did," the nurse wrote. "I wanted to speak up, but I was too afraid of losing my job. I don't expect forgiveness, but I needed you to know that I'm sorry." Alana's first instinct was anger. How could someone who had been complicit expect absolution? But as she reread the letter, her feelings shifted. The nurse's words were raw, vulnerable, a reminder of the fear that Grayson had instilled in everyone around him. That evening, she discussed the letter with Malcolm. "Do you think people like her deserve forgiveness?" she asked. Malcolm thought for a moment. Forgiveness isn't about letting them off the hook. It's about freeing yourself from the weight of their choices. If it helps you heal, then yes, forgive her. Alana nodded, a quiet resolve forming within her. She wrote back, thanking the nurse for her honesty and encouraging her to use her voice to advocate for others in the future. Months later, news broke that Edward Grayson was attempting to appeal his sentence. His lawyers argued that the trial had been biased, citing the media frenzy and public pressure as grounds for a retrial. The announcement sent shockwaves through the community. Protests erupted outside the courthouse, with supporters of Alana and Malcolm rallying to ensure justice was upheld. Alana, however, remained calm. "He can fight all he wants," she told Malcolm. "The truth doesn't change, and neither does the damage he caused." The appeal was ultimately denied, with the judge citing overwhelming evidence against Grayson. For Alana and Malcolm, it was a reaffirmation of the justice they had fought so hard to achieve. With the hospital thriving under its new leadership and the Equitable Care Act in place, Malcolm and Alana turned their attention to the future. They established the Richards Foundation, a nonprofit organization dedicated to improving healthcare access in underserved communities. The foundation's first major initiative was building free clinics in areas with limited medical resources. Alana personally oversaw the design of these clinics, ensuring they were welcoming and inclusive spaces. At the grand opening of the first clinic, Alana stood before a crowd of supporters and patients, her voice steady as she spoke. "This isn't just a building," she said, "it's a promise that everyone deserves care, compassion, and dignity, no matter where they come from, no matter who they are." The applause was thunderous, but Alana's gaze was focused on the people in the crowd, the mothers, fathers, and children who would benefit from the work she and Malcolm had done in the quiet moments of their lives. Malcolm and Alana reflected on how far they had come. Sitting together on their porch one evening, they watched the sun set over the horizon. "Do you ever think about how different things could have been?" Alana asked softly. Malcolm nodded. "All the time. But then I remember that everything we went through brought us here. And here is exactly where we're meant to be." Alana smiled, resting her head on his shoulder. The weight of the past hadn't disappeared, but it had transformed into something else, a foundation for a better future. As the years passed, the impact of Malcolm and Alana's work continued to ripple outward. The Richards Center became a model for equitable healthcare, inspiring similar reforms across the country. The foundation grew, reaching communities far and wide. Edward Grayson, once a towering figure in the medical world, faded into obscurity. His name became synonymous with corruption and abuse, a cautionary tale of what happens when power goes unchecked. But for Malcolm and Alana, the story wasn't about him. It was about the lives they had touched, the systems they had changed, and the legacy they had built together. And as they sat hand in hand, watching another sunset, they knew their journey, though painful, had been worth every step. Edward Grayson's conviction sent shockwaves through the medical community. His downfall wasn't just a personal tragedy, it became a symbol of a broken system that had allowed abuse and neglect to fester. Doctors, nurses, and administrators nationwide began questioning their own practices. Hospitals that had once prioritized profit over people scrambled to implement reforms, fearful of becoming the next scandal. For Alana and Malcolm, this was a bittersweet victory. At the Richards Center for Equity in Healthcare, they received letters from patients and staff across the country. Some shared their gratitude, others their own harrowing stories. One letter stood out, a handwritten note from a young medical student named Jordan. Dear Mr. and Mrs. Richards, I wanted to thank you for what you've done. I'm a black medical student, and for the first time, I feel like there's hope for people like me to make a real difference. You've shown the world that change is possible. I won't let you down. Reading the letter, Alana felt a pang of emotion. It was a reminder that their fight wasn't just about fixing the past. It was about inspiring the future. The Richards Foundation's initiatives began to gain traction. Clinics in underserved communities provided free medical care, while partnerships with universities offered scholarships for students from marginalized backgrounds to study medicine. Alana took a hands-on approach, visiting the clinics and speaking with patients. One day, she met an elderly woman named Mabel, who had come for a routine checkup. You remind me of my daughter, Mabel said, gripping Alana's hand tightly. She passed a few years ago. She always said someone needed to stand up to people like that. Doctor, what was his name? Grayson? Alana nodded, her throat tightening. I'm so sorry for your loss. Mabel smiled sadly. Thank you, dear, but seeing what you've done, it feels like she's still here. In some way, those moments kept Alana grounded, reminding her of the personal stakes in their fight for justice. Malcolm, meanwhile, was hard at work on expanding the Equitable Care Act. The bill had passed, but he knew its success depended on its enforcement. He traveled across the country, meeting with lawmakers, healthcare leaders, and activists to ensure the act's provisions were implemented effectively. At a town hall meeting in Chicago, Malcolm stood before a diverse crowd, answering questions about the act's goals. A young woman in the audience raised her hand. Mr. Richards, do you really think one law can change everything? Isn't the system too broken? Malcolm paused, considering her question. The system is broken, he admitted, but every great change starts with one step. This law isn't the solution, it's the foundation. And if we keep building on it, together, we can create a system that works for everyone. The applause was deafening, but Malcolm's focus remained on the faces in the crowd, the people who would carry this fight forward long after he was gone. As the years passed, Alana found herself grappling with an unexpected question. Could she forgive Edward Grayson? The thought gnawed at her, not because she believed he deserved forgiveness, but because she wanted to let go of the anger that lingered in her heart. One day, she confided in Malcolm. Do you think forgiveness makes me weak? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Malcolm took her hands in his. Forgiveness isn't weakness, Alana, it's strength, but it's also a choice. You don't owe him anything, not forgiveness, not your peace. You have to do what feels right for you. That night, Alana wrote a letter, not to Grayson, but to herself. She wrote about the pain he had caused, the strength she had found in its wake, and the life she had rebuilt despite him. When she finished, she folded the letter and placed it in a drawer, feeling lighter than she had in years. Edward Grayson's appeal had been denied, and he now spent his days as a forgotten figure in a cold, impersonal prison. Occasionally, he received letters, some from former patients, condemning him for his actions, others from strangers who saw him as a scapegoat for a larger system. One letter, however, caught his attention. It was from an anonymous sender who wrote, "You could have been great. Instead, you chose to be cruel. This is your legacy now." Grayson crumpled the letter, but the words stayed with him. For the first time, he began to question the choices that had led him to this point. It wasn't redemption, not yet, but a crack in the wall of denial he had built around himself, inspired by the Richards Foundation's success. Other organizations began adopting similar models. Clinics in rural and urban areas alike saw improvements in patient outcomes. And medical schools reported higher enrollment rates among students from marginalized backgrounds. Alana and Malcolm were invited to speak at conferences, their story becoming a beacon for change. At one event, Alana stood before a crowd of young doctors and medical students, her voice steady and filled with emotion. "You have the power to change lives," she said, "but that power comes with responsibility. Never forget why you chose this path. Never forget the people who trust you with their lives." Her words were met with a standing ovation. But more importantly, with resolve in the eyes of those who listened. One day, Alana received a call from the Richards Center. A young girl named Amara had been admitted to the emergency room. She was from a low-income family and had been turned away by another hospital because they couldn't afford the upfront costs. Alana rushed to the hospital, where she met Amara's tearful mother. They said they couldn't help her. The woman sobbed, "But you saved her." Watching the doctors at the center work tirelessly to stabilize Amara, Alana felt an overwhelming sense of pride. This was why she and Malcolm had fought so hard, to ensure that no one was denied care because of who they were or what they could afford years later. The Richards Center celebrated its 10th anniversary. Alana and Malcolm stood on the stage together, addressing a crowd of supporters, staff, and patients. Behind them, a new generation of leaders had emerged, doctors, nurses, and advocates who carried forward the values the Richards had championed. Among them was Jordan, the medical student who had written to them years earlier, now a practicing physician at the center. In his speech, Jordan said, "The Richards taught me that change is possible, that our voices matter, and now, it's our turn to continue the work they started." Alana and Malcolm exchanged a glance, their hearts full. Their journey hadn't been easy, but it had been worth every struggle, every sleepless night, every tear in the quiet of their home. Alana and Malcolm sat together on their porch, watching the sun dip below the horizon. The air was warm, filled with the scent of blooming flowers and the sound of distant laughter. "Do you think we did enough?" Alana asked, her voice soft. Malcolm took her hand, his eyes fixed on the horizon. "We did more than enough," he said, "and the best part? It's not over. The work will go on, long after we're gone." Alana smiled, leaning into him. "Then I think we can rest a little now." As the sun set on another day, they sat in peaceful silence, knowing they had left the world a little better than they had found it.